Hi there. Today let's look at the relationship of Egypt and Nubia as parts of Africa. Now, the subject of Egypt is just vast and certainly deserving of a whole course on its own merits and extensive history and extraordinary artwork. In this class, the focus is on Africa. And so I feel my purpose here is not so much to completely cover the topic, but to explain how Egypt is a part of Africa and the kinds of things we see in Egypt that directly relate back to other parts of Africa as well. And that seems like kind of an odd thing to say because it seems sort of obvious that Egypt is a part of Africa. But if you actually look at the history and the way people talk about Egypt, they often assume many of the kind of cultural biases that Egypt is somehow more a part of the Western tradition, and indeed has been taught as a part of the Western tradition. But in fact, in reality, much of Egypt owes its heritage, its culture, and its character to the traditions found in Africa. And so to explain this further, you can actually see in art museums now all over the country, people have taken their Egypt collections and they've merged them into their African collections. It's now rare that you see Egypt perceived in art museums, at least, as a separate entity, closer in connection to Europe and the Western tradition than it is in the traditions of Africa. And it did have and play a very important role in Western traditions and the development of Western culture. But that doesn't excise it from it belonging in the continent of Africa. So let's go back in time, way, way back in time, to some of the earliest art we have in North Africa that is now the Sahara Desert. And out in these vast desert regions, North Africa, we see these etched illustrations, drawings of extraordinary realistic character of giant fauna like elephants and crocodiles and giraffes and all kinds of other animals that don't live there at all anymore. And that is one of the key evidence we have how much the ecology of Sahara has changed, that for many thousands and millions of years, in fact, it was a lush green place full of forests and wildlife. And so we have to look at that and understand, that's a very important change in the ecology of Africa that's had a huge impact. And what was the cause of that, we'll explore a little while. So we see these carvings. It's very hard to date these because of the fact that they're on exposed rock and they're sort of etched into the rock. You don't have the kind of geological features or qualities that make it possible to date them with any accuracy. All we can tell is that this animal, this elephant in this case, doesn't exist here and hasn't existed here until about 8000 BCE. So we know that this was done during the time that elephants existed in this region. And so the Central Saharan rock art is, in a sense, a lot of it deals with these sort of animals, this extraordinary animals that we see all over the place. And many of them were sites and areas that had been worked on for thousands of years, layering upon layering, making the dating of these even more difficult. Now, I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about rock art in this class, especially when we get down to South Africa, where we actually know a great deal more about the symbolism and meaning of the art because of the unique character of those works that have survived. But here in the north, we have a kind of interesting shift. It tells us about the changing nature of human civilizations. Basically, the archaic forms, or these sort of large animals, they start to disappear as the ecology of North Africa is changing. We start to see is what we call the Roundhead style from about 8,000 to 6,000 BCE. We see these humans wearing clothing, jewelry, adornments. We see kind of human civilization being modeled. We see the domestication of animals. And these kinds of information tells us that human society is no longer concerned with these giant animals, but we're looking more at this kind of human society as it's evolving. We also start to see a kind of deified-like images. Most striking is this one called the horned female figure, or this dancing figure. Now, this is in southern Tunisia, in the Tassili Niger area, Saharan desert, in this rock form. And you can see that on this, that we have this female figure with these giant horns sprouting from her head, and clearly sort of running, leaping, dancing. And this horned female character is, interestingly enough, very similar to this horned female character that can be found in ancient Egyptian deities named Hathor. And so this is a kind of possible connection that the people who lived in the Saharan desert and created these early deities, this sort of horned female deity, would eventually migrate as the desert became more and more inhospitable, as the land dried out and become desert. They migrated toward the Nile, bringing with them the culture they had developed there in the Sahara Desert. So here's, you can see actually a drawing of that rock painting. It's a little bit easier to kind of make out the figure. And notice the figure's not alone, but there's a whole company of other figures moving, dancing, running, suggesting this kind of dynamic. You also start to notice this kind of flowing nature of the sort of ribbons on the hands and along the ankles and the waist. And then above the head, there's this kind of cloud-like form with rain coming down, possibly lightning as well crossing through there. And that's a symbol, of course, a powerful symbol of fertility. Rain brings so much to the dry region of the Sahara and becomes a very important part of it. We also have early sculptural forms. You notice this female figure here with these broad hips and these sort of arms looping back behind the head, sort of like the shape of horns. And this is a very interesting thing. There's also this kind of bird-like shape to the face. Nobody knows exactly what these mean or what they're found. But again, these fertility symbols seem to evoke a kind of desire for that connection of fertility and the continual growth of the community. Then from about 5,000 to 2,000 BCE, we really start to see the greater domestication of animals, and we see horses, we see cattle. In this pastoralist style, this was a very big part of the decay of the Saharan desert. They believe humans played a very significant role in the drying up by overbreeding animals and creating conditions for exhausting the soil, which is notoriously thin in Africa. They created this vast wasteland, and they were forced to migrate into the Nile, which is perennially fed by this huge river and was able to sustain human civilization in a much more stable way. Here's another example. As you can see here, the pastoralist style, this is sort of typical of this art. It's in low overhanging caves, unlike the kind of cave art we see in Africa, which is really deep into the interior of a cave and often very hidden. This art tends to be, or what we have of this art tends to be in more, shallow caves and semi-exposed rock areas. The other thing that's interesting about the early rock art is that some of the figuration from this pastoralist style starts to tie into some of the figuration we see in early Egyptian art. Notice the treatment of the movement of horses, especially, and the kind of flatness of the figure that we see in the rock art sort of brought over into that low relief carving in early Egyptian art. Nile culture, as people began to migrate into Nile, a number of civilizations set up there and began trading up and down the Nile. In about the second half of the 5th millennium, plants and animals are domesticated along the Nile. And then we start to see this sort of uniform culture where people are sharing common ideas. Language is probably becoming more and more unified. And we start to see a kind of political and economic consolidation and coordination throughout the region. These are these beautiful ripple flake knives. This is one of the more advanced stone technologies we see in the late Neolithic period. One of the things I find is so extraordinary about these ripple flake knives is how they sort of exceed their function with extraordinary care in craftsmanship. You know, it's fairly easy to create a rock that has a sharp edge that can serve most purposes of what you want to do. But if you look at the fineness of the execution here, the incredible skill and craft that went into knapping, which is that sort of applying specific pressure to the stone so that it breaks in just the right area to create that beautifully curved shape, to create even flakes along the spine of this in such a regular fashion, is really an extraordinary skill, a really tremendous skill. One that, as I say, sort of exceeds its function. To create a knife that has these features is to suggest that your knife is more than just an ordinary tool. It may have other purposes. It may serve not just a kind of physical tool, but it may also have a kind of spiritual or cultural significance as well. So let's look at some of the continuities that we see early on developed in Egypt that we find elsewhere in Africa. To begin with, there are lots of depictions of female fertility, especially women and children play a very important role in Egyptian art and elsewhere in Africa. We know that male circumcision and initiation rites were conducted in Egypt as well as all over Africa. Ancestor worship, which eventually would become the worship of the pharaoh, a very large product of ancient Egypt. And this idea of the divine kingship, that the king is not just another human being, but is somehow connected to the ancestors, connected to the legacy and the continuity of rulers from the past. We also see animal deities, ways in which humans and animals have a kind of common spiritual core and share powers with each other. And also, one of these really interesting sort of domestic things is this headdress, where you can see this little wooden thing. This is from ancient Egypt. This would be something that someone would just use as a pillow. They would rest their head on it and keep their head off the ground. And of course, this is very important because there are lots of, you don't want your hair to get all dirty, and a pillow like we have stuffed would only sort of get, invaded by all kinds of parasites. So this is a very simple, efficient, cool, as in, cooling way to rest your head while you sleep. And you see these all over Africa. We'll see a number of examples throughout the course. So about 3,200 BCE, we start to see in the historic record references to military campaigns. And eventually there's a unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay, so this is where the cataracts, where you have the waterfalls, and this is sort of the Upper Egypt is where you have the further back into the Nile, which is more difficult to reach. This was sort of conquered and brought in and creating a kind of unified. And whenever Egypt is unified in this way, this becomes a very significant part in the history of Egypt, that it sort of controls both Upper and Lower Egypt. This becomes a very key component in the legitimacy of the pharaoh. The third dynasty, the basic character of Egyptian culture is defined. So like this idea of the pharaoh cult, and also burial rites, and all kinds of, the sort of ceremonial function of the priesthood, and the way the priests legitimized the pharaoh's reign through the maintenance, this extraordinary maintenance of the cult of the pharaoh. There are a lot of interesting and extraordinary features about ancient Egypt and the pyramids, and I wish I had more time to go in greater length about them, their cosmological significance, the extraordinary astronomical alignments that they were able to achieve with these huge structures. All of this is something that, of course, well worth your time and study. But as a class on Africa, I'm going to just touch on a few things here to keep our focus on ways in which we can look at the things that were happening in Egypt relative to the larger topic of Africa. The Sphinx is a very interesting ancient feature that predates the pyramids and seems to have been an important part of the sort of legitimizing of the pharaoh's cult later on as the pyramids were built. The face of Khafra, who is put on there, was probably carved later, that the body is an older part of an older kind of pharaoh cult, most likely. And Khafra's face was, again, carved into this. And this is a very important idea because much of what happens in Egyptian art is not just the creation of the pharaoh cult, but also the kind of editing out and the removal and the change and the constant change to eliminate that sense that there was anything but complete continuity and consistency throughout all the dynasties. So if there was any fluctuation, if there was any change, they would change the art to meet the new reality and make the history reflect the idea that it really was this sort of unchanging dynastic rule. And that's an important kind of cultural point to think about Egypt. Why was it so important to maintain that continuity? And you see that in much of the art. Very interesting, the kind of static character, especially of early Egyptian art, the art concerning the pharaoh and the pharaoh's family. We see these very sort of tight, rigid forms and this very stylized way in which they rendered the bodies and the proportions of the body, which was this sort of Old Kingdom standard grid where it was based on the dimensions of the fist. And so that you could, by looking at the width of the fist, you could sort of mark out the proportions of the classic proportions of the whole figure. And so this way they have this kind of grid that they put onto all things. And this was the way their language worked, and their sculpture, their art was really a kind of building out of their language. It had the same kind of character as their language. These pictures represented ideas. These statues were like their language. They represented sort of fixed ideas that were supposed to be eternal. They were supposed to be ways of communicating to the gods and the ancestors in this very conservative way. And so we start to see the royal daughter of Neferu, this Senenmut right here, this the granite statue of Senenmut holding Princess Neferu. This is again the way in which the mother embracing this daughter, this dynastic connection that is very important in the establishment of the pharaoh cult. And as I mentioned earlier, there's some really interesting animal deities, not just Hathor, the goddess, the Western goddess, the horned goddess from the Western desert, plays an important role in ancient Egyptian art. But also in the rites of the dead, we have the jackal-headed god Anubis. We have one very unique and interesting feature. Now, this is the only mask we have that has survived from ancient times. And it's a very interesting mask. It's the mask of the jackal-headed god. It looks like it's designed to be worn. You notice there's a sort of loops, holes around the base that look like fit where the shoulders would go. And there's eye holes where somebody might be able to peer out below. And this ceramic fired mask may have been worn by a priest who was conducting these ancient rites, plays a very important role in bringing the dead into the underworld and weighing their heart. Their heart must be lighter than a feather. Another way we can look at the idea of continuity in Egyptian art in Africa is the way in which there was one very spectacular and very important pharaoh who was a woman. Now, the vast majority of the pharaohs were male, and all the iconography about male pharaohs is very consistent. It's so consistent that when Hatshepsut was made a pharaoh, or actually she really proclaimed herself as pharaoh, as all the other heirs were too young and inexperienced to take over. She was a very effective woman in the role, built lots of monuments to the gods and unified the Upper and Lower Egypt. And in her own iconography, so that she would project the continuity of the pharaohs of the past, she is depicted wearing a beard. Now we'll go on to part 2. We'll discuss more of early Egyptian art and Nubia.